Cellular respiration is where we're starting here. Cellular respiration. We have to call it that because a lot of people confuse the word respiration with breathing. And of course, breathing is only one part of cellular respiration. That's how we obtain the oxygen. But also eating is the other part of cellular respiration, which is how we obtain the products that we break down into glucose. So cellular respiration basically has sort of three separate little sections to it. Cellular respiration involves the oxidation of glucose, which is something you've seen here in earlier grades. Here's the famous equation that we learned. And in fact, this is a two-way equation in the presence of, when I write it this way, it's exergonic. It will happen without any input. But if you write it backwards, you'll recall that you have to add over the arrow here. You have to write, if you write this going this way, you have to put in chlorophyll, sunlight energy added into the equation. Remember that? Because that's what plants do, but they need extra energy input because the reverse of this, the green arrow direction, is an endergonic reaction where you're creating more order and storing energy in molecules. Whereas the black arrow, going the way we're going to go, is the releasing of energy and is exergonic. We're making littler molecules that are less organized. And so we are creating more disorder, the way the universe wants to go. So what we have to do is we have to figure out how this process works in all of its steps and stages. So we're gonna look at three sort of stages. The first stage is called glycolysis, which is the splitting apart of the glucose molecule into two smaller molecules that can then play a role in the next stage. So after glycolysis, the products of glycolysis go into something called the citric acid cycle, which has formerly been, or was previously known as the Krebs cycle, named after the scientist. So I'm going to probably call it the Krebs cycle more often than I call it the citric acid cycle, because that's how we all learned it. But textbooks now usually call it the citric acid cycle. It means the same thing. And then the products of the Krebs cycle, well, the Krebs cycle is a cycle, so it doesn't technically have products, sort of has products. The molecules basically go in a circle, turning into each other and going around and around, and then they are coupled to little reactions that produce the ATP and NADs and other things that we'll see. So the things that come out of this go into something called the electron transport chain, which occurs on the membrane of the mitochondria. Electron transport chain. Okay? So those are the three major steps. And each of these three major steps has many smaller steps inside, many chemical steps. So we're going to begin today with glycolysis, and we're just going to go that far. And we're going to trace the changes that happen to glucose as it is prepared, turned into the products for the citric acid cycle. All right. We all set to go? Down we go. So we'll put a subtitle here, glycolysis, except I won't write all over the board like that. Okay, let's pick blue for our title. Glycolysis. Glycolysis, the breaking down of glucose, right? To lyse means to break. So we're going to start with a glucose molecule. Now, all right, I'm just trying to think of how to lay it out on the smartboard because I'm limited in space. Typically on the whiteboard, I would go all the way across in nice arrows and lines, but we're going to have to just kind of do it in bits and pieces here. So we'll go back to black for our basic color, and we are going to draw a picture of glucose. And here's our glucose with all of its functional groups. Now, of course, glucose is the breakdown product, or the product of the catabolism of larger things. So when you eat, typically we don't eat glucose directly. We can, but typically we eat foods that are much more complex, that we eat starches. And you know now that starches are polymers of glucose or isomers of glucose, right? And they can all be turned into glucose. So we're going to study the pathway of just glucose, and then we'll realize later that other isomers can sort of pop into the pathway at different points and also be oxidized in the same way. So there's glucose. So the first step that happens is that glucose has to be pumped up a little bit. It's got lots of energy in it, but we need to get things going. We need a match to light this fire. It's an exergonic reaction, but it needs a kickstart. So what our body has to do is it has to actually add an ATP molecule here. So I'm going to put this in red. So ATP, which is the high energy molecule, has to sort of cycle in at this point, and it has to become ADP. It has to lose its phosphate. And the phosphate that it lost is going to be attached to the glucose molecule. So we're transferring the energy of the ATP to the glucose. It's a coupled reaction. So now what we're going to do is draw that glucose molecule and show the phosphate attached to it. So let's draw another glucose here with an O. And bottom part of the molecule is pretty much the same. OH. And whoops, sorry, that's wrong. Yeah, that's right. That's right. I realized I forgot an OH over here, didn't I? We better add that guy in on the other glucose. And then up here we have the CH2, right? But it's not CH2OH, it's CH2O, and then attached to it, I'm just going to use a capital P for the phosphate. I'm not going to draw the P's and all the O's because it gets a little bit nut bar. So we'll put a P, we'll put a little circle around it. So that's the phosphate. So the triphosphate over here becomes a diphosphate, and the extra phosphate is now attached to this glucose molecule. There is an enzyme that is responsible for making this happen. And I'm going to write the enzymes in green. Okay? An enzyme that's responsible for making this happen. This one is called hexokinase. Now, all of these enzymes end with A's, so that's easy for you to notice or recognize them. And they're all sort of named kind of in Latin for what job they do. If you look at the molecule of glucose, the little carbon at the top, the CH2OH part, that's carbon number 6, right? And so what this does is it attaches the phosphate to the carbon number 6. Hexo for 6. Kinase is often used to mean attached to, right? Or to move it to. You can think about it that way. And so we attach it to there, and then we have the names of these two molecules. This one is called glucose, we know that. But this one now has a new name, and its name is glucose 6-phosphate. Glucose 6-phosphate. So that's pretty straightforward. You added a phosphate to carbon number 6, so now it's called glucose 6-phosphate. And that's the first step. What's important to realize is what we've done here is we've lit a match to glucose. We've suddenly given it an elevated state of energy. Because of the addition of this bond, the glucose is now sort of a little more jittery than it was before, right? And now we're going to utilize that energy to turn it into some other things. All right, so the first, that's step 1, okay? And now step 2 is going to be what happens to the glucose 6-phosphate. So I'm not going to draw I'm not going to draw the glucose 6-phosphate again. I'm just going to draw an arrow, right, which will lead us underneath to step 2. So, or the second step. Actually, will that work? No, because then I can't do my enzymes. All right, so here's what we'll do. We'll do each step individually. So we're going to actually double up. We're going to double up. We're going to take those arrows away. And I'll take this one away. So the second step, I'll redraw the glucose 6-phosphate and draw it again in the second step. So down here, I will redraw the glucose 6-phosphate. Plus it's practice for us drawing. So the second step, I'll draw a nice line here. No, this is not the citric acid cycle yet. This is just glycolysis part, and as many steps. Okay, so here's glucose 6-phosphate again. And I'll draw in all the respective OH groups. And then up here, CH2O, and I'll put our little phosphate guy in there, P. Okay, so that's the same picture as I have right here. Just drawing it again. And we'll write its name underneath, glucose 6-phosphate. So what happens now is there is a little switcheroo. This jiggery high energy molecule that we have now created, because of the help of an enzyme, there's an enzyme that can allow it. So remember how enzymes work. It hooks up with the enzyme. The enzyme will twist it and pull on it, right, using all those functional groups that the proteins have, and rearrange its shape. And so it will turn into an isomer. So nothing's being added or subtracted. We're just rearranging the shape of this molecule. And so the enzyme that does this is called phosphoglycerice. Nice, eh? They have some cool names. So it's the phosphoglyco. So that's just Latin for a glucose with phosphate, which is what we have. So the phosphoglyco and then isomer means it's going to turn it into an isomer, and it ends with A's because all enzymes end with A's. Phosphoglycoisomerase, all one word. All one word. And the isomer that it turns into is fructose 6-phosphate. Question. Okay. So we're going to get fructose 6-phosphate. Let's draw that one. So fructose 6-phosphate is essentially a fructose molecule. So we'll put a little O on top. It's the 5-sided version. But remember, it's still an isomer. It still has all the same numbers of atoms. CH2OH over here. And then we have our OH. Remember, the OH for fructose is reversed in the middle here. So it goes there. And then on this side, we have our CH2 up here. So typically we'll make this a little bit longer. CH2O, but it's not CH2OH because it has the phosphate still attached. There's our phosphate still attached to. And I forgot an OH down here on this side. And the OH over here on this side, and that should complete the picture. And this is called fructose 6-phosphate. And so remember, the enzyme, phosphoglycoisomerase, has just the right shape for a glucose 6-phosphate to lodge inside of it. And when it does, it gets twisted and pushed and pulled and turned into fructose 6-phosphate. So nothing has been added or subtracted yet. It's just an isomerization, we call this. Okay, so far so good. Ready for the next step? All right, so the next step will be to take that fructose 6-phosphate. So we're going to draw it again. Right about here, okay. So fructose 6-phosphate. There we go. I'll draw this line a little bit higher because that's where the CH2O, and then we have, yeah, that's on that side, right? And then we have our OHs sort of here and here. CH2OH over here. And I'll put in that phosphate before I forget. The phosphate is attached here. Now remember, when the phosphate is the P with the 4 O's, but we're just doing this as a simpler version of it, so we don't have to draw that every time. So there we have the same molecule that we had right here. Oh, I forgot an OH again. Let's put the other hydroxyl right here, and I think we're good to go. So now this is going to be a reaction, and what's going to happen at this point is we have to supercharge this molecule again. We have to give it another boost, and so to do that, we're going to take an ATP molecule, another one. It's going to come into this reaction and it's going to leave as ADP. So it's going to drop another phosphate off. So we're going to double phosphorylize this fructose molecule. So it will be extra energetic. And so to draw that, we have sort of right in the middle here, I'll put the O and down like this. And then put all our pieces in. So on this side, just to save space, I'm going to draw this backwards. CH2, I'm going to put the organic phosphate that was here, inorganic phosphate, sorry, over this on this side, just to kind of save space. Oh, I forgot the O. I think I can squeeze the O in there. CH2, the O, and then the phosphate. So all I did is just flip that in the mirror, right? I reversed that around just to save some space because the other phosphate is going to attach over here on the other side. So we're going to have the CH2O here, and the other phosphate now is attached here, right there. So we have a double phosphorylated molecule. Then we go back and finish up with all of our other little OHs and things that we need here, like this. Okay. I'm not liking this in the middle here, or this one. I'm going to redraw this properly. I shouldn't have tried to squeeze that in. But what we want is we want a bond, and then we want to get the oxygen. Actually, the oxygen can be black, right? So the oxygen right there, and then the phosphate will stick on the end there, right there. That looks better. So we have two of them. And so the name of this molecule is fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. Bisphosphate. Fructose. So here we have fructose 6-phosphate. I'm going to get a thinner marker. And this one is fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. Fructose 1,6, because the other phosphate has been attached to carbon 1, right? That's carbon 1 on the right side and carbon 6 on the left side. So this is how we write it. We write 1,6. Fructose 1,6 with dashes on either side. And then you should start writing it right here, but I'm going to run out of room, so I'm just going to jump underneath here. bisphosphate. Bisphosphate. Oops, I'll come back. I gotta get the phone. 1 second. All right, let's go back here. So bisphosphate. I gotta fix this. The telephone messed me up. Yep. Yeah, we'll take a little break here just as soon as we finish this one step, okay? Bisphosphate. Because the 6, so this is carbon 1, or sorry, no, this is carbon, yeah, this is carbon 1, or this is carbon 6, and this is carbon 1, right? So if you go by the numbers of the carbons, the numbers just tell you which carbons the phosphates have attached to, right? So it's 1,6 bisphosphate. Not biphosphate, bisphosphate with an S, bisphosphate. Okay, we'll take a little break and we'll come back in a second, right? The enzyme, let's just do the enzyme that makes this happen, and it's called phosphofructokinase. So it's a phosphofructose, and they're adding another phospho to it. So you see the similarity, phosphofructokinase, and the one up here was called hexokinase, adding on to 6. And so this one's called phosphofructokinase. Okay, we'll take a short break and come back in a minute. So there was some confusion about this. If we go back, we jumped back to step number 2, right? And the name of this isomer, apparently in the textbook, it is called something different in your book. It's a similar name. It's called phosphoglucomutase. That's just another name for this same enzyme. Doesn't really matter which one you call it. You can see how it's named. To mutate means to change. So we've changed the phosphoglucose into the fructose. So it's a phosphoglucomutase. That's another name for it, but it's the same enzyme. It's not anything different. So it doesn't really matter which one you want to call it. I suppose you can call it. I like the phosphoglucoisomerase myself. In the AP textbook, that's what it's called. So that's the one that I'm going to use. Okay, so we're sliding down. I'm trying to slide down, but I can't get the smartboard to cooperate. There we go. Okay, so here's where we left off. So we have the fructose 1,6 bisphosphate molecule. So we're going to draw that one again. For the next step. So I'm going to draw it kind of small. These molecules are getting big, but they're going to get small soon because the whole point is to break them apart, right? So here's our fructose, CH2O, and then we'll write OCH2 on this side. And we have to put some OHs in their appropriate spots, hydroxyls, and then we have 2 of the phosphates. One is attached here, and the other is attached over here on this side. I think that looks pretty good. And that's called fructose 1,6 bisphosphate. So we'll write it in, fructose 1. Oops, I should put a dash there. Better erase that. Try not to go too fast. Fructose dash 1,6 dash bisphosphate. Okay. And now what's going to happen is one of 2 things. This is interesting. So we're going to draw this in a funny way. This can be turned into 2 molecules. One's going to go this way, and the other one's going to go down below. So let's draw the first one in. The first one is, it basically splits the molecule in half. So what we get is a 6-carbon sugar that's being cut into two 3-carbon sugars. So the first one looks like this. It's got the little phosphate attached. It's one end of the molecule. And it's got an O and a CH2. You can see that's the top part on the left-hand side. And then that has got a C, a double bond O, and then a CH2 OH on the bottom. And that's called dihydroxyacetone phosphate. Okay? So dihydroxyacetone phosphate. 2 words. Dihydroxyacetone phosphate. The other half of the molecule, it gets split, and this is going to be tricky because I have to go down below here. Okay, give me a second. Okay, so we're going to go down here. What do you mean? The one I'm going to draw now? No. The one I'm going to draw now is the other half of the molecule, right? Let me check. Here? Did I put the P in the wrong place? No, you're jumping ahead because you're looking at the other molecule. This is the dihydroxyacetone phosphate, which is sort of the left half of the molecule with one phosphate attached. The other molecule is the glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, which is one we're going to draw next. So what we're showing here is this 6-carbon molecule is going to break into 2. So what we need is another arrow to show the other part. So it also breaks into a second molecule. And this is the one that you're talking about. And it looks like this. So we have H, and then we have a C double bond O, and then we have a CHOH, and then we have a CH2 with an O, and then it has the phosphate attached down the bottom. That's called glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. Glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. I think your textbook says exactly the same thing, so I'm just watching for the names that they don't get confused. Glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. So let's write that in. So essentially, from this point on, since we've split the 6-carbon molecule into 2 3-carbon molecules, we're going to end up with double everything. What we have here on the right side of the board, because of this isomerase, means that effectively we can just count the products here as 2 of the glyceraldehyde 3-phosphates. Okay? So what you have to do is remember that everything we draw from this point on has to be doubled because it's happening to 2 of these molecules. But we're just going to draw 1, obviously, because it's too much trouble to draw them all. So, times 2 from this point on. Okay? So let's draw our glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate again. There we go. CH2O. Put our little, oh, I forgot the O. Rats. Put the O in there first. O, and then the phosphate still stuck on. And then the rest of it is, what do we got here at the top? Oh, CH2OH. This is a double bond O at this guy. Right here. There. There's our molecule. It's the same as this one up here. Okay. right there. Should look the same as that. I think it does. And so now it's going to be turned into something. What we're going to do now is we're going to add another phosphate, but we're going to do this one in a slightly different way. There's another energy-carrying molecule that we're going to use. So let me just draw the product in first. We're going to take another phosphate and stick it on the top. So we'll do that. And then we're going to have our little O here and a C and a double bond O. And then we're going to have a CHOH underneath. And then we're going to have a CH2 and an O and another phosphate on this side. So where does this phosphate come from? Well, it doesn't come from ATP. Instead, there's a different molecule. There are two of them, and they're called NAD pluses. Now, they would be floating around in the cytoplasm, and we're going to learn where they come from later. Okay? So just bear with me on that. We're going to learn where they come from later. They come into this reaction, and two things happen. They turn into two NADH. And in the process, two inorganic phosphates have to go into this. So what we have to do now is we have to write under here, two PIs go in to the process. They would be floating in the cytoplasm, right? Or being made available. And it's the energy of this blue molecule, this NAD, that sticks these floating by phosphate groups onto here. So they don't come directly from an ATP. They may have come, though, from an ATP that split generating heat or split for some other reason. Remember, this is a big soup, right? And as much as we like to draw these lines and say this turns into that and this turns into that, what's really happening is everything's turning into everything in a giant soup of interactions. And so products from other reactions can be used in this reaction, and all kinds of things are kind of going on at the same time. Okay, so now we have this molecule, which is called 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. So this one was called glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. And now with the addition of the next phosphate on it, it's called 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate, all one word. And remember the glycerol molecule in fats? Do you remember it, what it looked like? It's actually over there on the board. It has the 3 carbons with the fatty acids attached. Well, you can see how this is pretty much the same molecule, the 3 carbons, which is why it's got that same word in there. The glycerate comes from the glycerol. So it's very similar to that. And of course, there's an enzyme. What's the enzyme that makes this happen? Triose phosphate dehydrogenase. Triose phosphate dehydrogenase. I'm going to have to write that in small here. The enzyme that makes this happen is triose phosphate dehydrogenase. Triose means 3 carbon sugar, or 3, which is what the glycerate is. And phosphate is obviously attaching a phosphate, and dehydrogenase means to take a hydrogen away. If you look at this molecule, we had to remove this hydrogen molecule in order to stick the phosphate on, right? So the dehydrogenase is referring to pulling off that hydrogen to add a phosphate to a 3 carbon sugar molecule. That's what it means. So it's all just Latin for what's being done. Okay. All right. So we have 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. We're almost at the end. Do we need time or can I move? Okay, let's move on. So we're going to redraw that 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate for the next step. So we can put a line under here if we want, and then move down. And of course it has 2 phosphates. So let me put the first phosphate in at the top, P, and then we'll go back to black, and we'll write in the O and the C, double bond O, and the CHOH, and the CH2, and the O, and then the last phosphate group that was attached right here, phosphate. And we'll call it its name, 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. Okay, now something interesting is going to happen. This reaction, we are going to, one of those phosphates that's been added is now going to be removed, and it's going to be added to an ADP molecule. And we're going to remake one of the ATPs. And remember that everything is happening twice, right? Times 2. So what I'm going to write here is I'm going to write in red an ADP is coming into the reaction, and it's going to be turned into an ATP because one of those phosphates is going to be stuck on it. But remember, that's going to be happening twice because everything from this point, from that last step, is doubled, right? Okay? So we're just drawing 1/2 of what's happening. So remember, you're actually going to make 2 ATPs at this stage because this same thing is happening to another molecule just like it. Okay? So there is 2 in total, and your textbook might have 2, I don't know. But we're only drawing 1/2 of it, so we're going to do the totals after anyway. We're going to summarize the totals, okay? Okay, so here we go. And that means if the phosphate is taken off, it's no longer bisphosphoglycerate, it's just phosphoglycerate. And so we go back and draw the phosphoglycerate like this. It's got an O here, it's got a C, a double bond O, it's got a CHOH, and then it's got a CH2O, and only 1 phosphate attached. And there's a little negative charge here to show that that's where the H was before. Remember? Well, the H isn't going to reattach because this molecule is rapidly going to turn into something else anyway. So that's called 3-phosphoglycerate. Whoops, that's the wrong color. 3-phosphoglycerate. Okay, I'm just going to erase that and start again. 3 with a dash phosphoglycerate. Did I miss a couple? Did I miss one there? Yeah. So, okay, let's just look at that. We'll pause and just see if there's a correction that needs to be. We'll continue on. So we'll go back. We're all set. We're all good. There's nothing to correct. And we also have to look at the enzyme that turns this 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate into 3-phosphoglycerate, and it's called phosphoglycerokinase. Phosphoglycerokinase. So we'll write that in. Phosphoglycerokinase, all one word. Yep, there's a little negative you're talking about right here. That's a negative charge, just to show that the H that used to be there is, remember, in solution, water pulls those H's off, right, and ionizes things. And since this molecule is rapidly going to turn into something else, The H is not going to have a chance to go back on. Okay, basically 2 more steps, so we're almost at the end. What did I write? No, phosphoglycerokinase. Phosphoglycerokinase. Okay, next step. The 3-phosphoglycerate, we'll redraw that one, and we will use it to move on to the next step. So we have the O with the little minus on it. We have this, we have the C double bond O, we have the CHOH, and then the CH2, and the O, and the little phosphate attached. And we called this guy 3-phosphoglycerate. And of course, there will be a reaction that turns this into something else. What happens here is interesting. The phosphate group that is at the bottom, the P, is simply going to be pulled off and reattached in a different spot. It's a relocation of the phosphate by this enzyme. Okay, so the new molecule looks like this. It's essentially the same molecule, but here in the middle, I'll just leave that CH2OH. The phosphate gets bumped over here. It gets pulled off the bottom and added to the top. We should put a little charge on that oxygen as well, just to remember. And so this one, because you've moved it, it's called 2-phosphoglycerate. That's all that's happened. It's on a different carbon, so its number changes. 2-phosphoglycerate. And the phosphoglyceromutase is the enzyme that causes this to happen. Phosphoglycerate. Mutase. Mutant, it's like a mutant molecule, right? Question? Yeah, so, okay, so the 2 molecules. So if you go all the way back to this stage right here, I wrote ×2. So that means that everything we do afterwards, everything after this point is actually doubled. But rather than draw everything twice, yeah, we're just going to draw them once, right? So there's 2 of those, right? Okay. So if you want, you can go back and you can write ×2 on every box or every stage if you want to remind you of that after that point. Okay, how do you pronounce what? Phosphoglyceromutase. That's how you pronounce it. Okay, 2 phosphoglycerates. I'll wait. Okay. Very close to the end now. So let's draw the 2-phosphoglycerate again and see what happens to it. So, 2-phosphoglycerate, double bond O, and the CH2 and the O. That's where the phosphate is going to stick on in a second, and then CH2OH down below. So I'll put the phosphate on there, and we'll call this guy his name, which is 2-phosphoglycerate. 2-phosphoglycerate, and we will draw what happens to him. And he's going to turn into something called phosphoenol pyruvate. Okay, so correction, right here there's no 2. This little 2 where I attached that phosphate shouldn't be there. If you count the hands, carbon is holding on to the H, 2 other carbons in the O, so that's good correction. Okay, let's draw in the phosphoenol pyruvate. Phosphoenol pyruvate, so O, and then we have a C double bond O, and then we have a C and an O, and then a double bond, CH2 at the bottom. And the phosphate is still attached to that O, so we'll put the phosphate right here. So you can see this molecule is slightly different. Slightly different. There's been a little bit of a change here. If you count up the atoms, what you'll notice is that water has come off of this. In order to make this happen, we have to take two H's and an O away. Okay? Two H's and an O. So what we've done is you'll notice this H is gone and this OH is gone. And there's the water that's been removed to produce this molecule. And his name is phosphoenol pyruvate. So let's write his name underneath. It's a funny name. Make sure you spell it right. Phosphoenol pyruvate. Phosphoenol pyruvate. Okay? And then we have the enzyme that goes with it, and it is called enolase. Enolase. Phosphoenol pyruvate. The enzyme is enolase. All right, one step to go. One step to go. And remember, times 2, right? Everything is times 2. Everything from this point. Okay, I need to explain that again. So I'm going to go back here to remind you because everyone's confused. At this point, at this step, we made 2 molecules out of 1, which means everything that happens afterwards is happening double because it's happening to 2 glyceraldehyde 3-phosphates. So times 2 all the way down. Everything that we've drawn at this point on is actually double. Okay? So let's do our last step and we can wrap this up. The last step is to take the phosphoenol pyruvate. So let's draw it in again. O, C, C, CH2. There's a double bond there. There's an O here. There's a double bond O. And then we have our phosphate. So it's the same molecule we just drew, like that. And it's going to turn into a new molecule. And in order to do this, we are going to have to take 2 ADPs again. I'm not going to write the 2, though, because we've already wrote times 2 up above. So what happens here is ADP floats by, is going to pick up this phosphate. So the phosphate, you can see how it serves as an energy donating molecule or functional group that's been added and subtracted all through here. We added it on at the beginning. We added it and subtracted it throughout the steps to sort of energize the molecules. But in the end, it's gone. We're left with a final molecule that doesn't have that ATP, or that phosphate group, attached. And the final molecule looks like this. O, C double bond O, C double bond O, CH3. Nice simple molecule, and it's called pyruvate. And of course, pyruvate kinase is the enzyme that makes this happen. Pyruvate kinase. The what? This is the final product of glycolysis. It's the final product, and we should also write times 2. So you actually are going to end up with 2 pyruvate molecules when it's all said and done, because this whole thing has happened twice. And the ATP here will be 2 that are actually going to be used. Okay, the phosphate is now removed. So the adding and subtracting of the phosphate, you can see how it's a way of coupling these reactions. We had to make certain things sort of go against their tendency. We had to make some endergonic reactions happen by using the energy of that phosphate. in the bonds. And then in the end, we've got everything turned into this molecule. Okay, so what we should now quickly do is a very fast summary to wrap it up. Okay? So the very fast summary is going to be in words. And before we do the summary, I noticed too, we didn't write the name here, so we should write this in, phosphoenolpyruvate again. There we go. Okay, are we ready for the summary? Okay. So to summarize, all we're going to do is write words. And we'll write it sort of in a chart form. And we'll start at the top. So the first molecule that we're going to write is glucose. Glucose, which then becomes glucose 6-phosphate. Oh, sorry. Got a mess here. Fix that. Glucose 6-phosphate. Okay? We won't write the enzyme. Well, maybe we'll write the enzymes in at the end. Then glucose 6-phosphate becomes fructose 6-phosphate. Okay, so far so good. Then fructose 6-phosphate becomes fructose 6-phosphate. I lost my line thickness. Becomes the fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. Oh, I did it backwards. Sorry. I'm trying to go fast so we can get done before the lunch period. That shouldn't be. Fructose 1,6 bisphosphate. But there's an important thing that happens at this step that we're going to put in here. We're going to go in red, and we're going to remind ourselves that at this point, 2 ATP molecules had to go in to deliver those phosphates, right? Or 1 ATP, I guess we'll say. ATP and ADP. Okay? And we also should go back to the first step, which I neglected to do, and remember that in order to add the phosphate in here, an ATP had to be involved. Whenever ATP turns into ADP, that's using energy. That's putting energy into the molecules. And that energy is a loss, right? It's like lighting your fire with a match. You have to use a little bit of match first. So our body actually has to use up some ATP energy to make energy. It's a little kickstart. So that's important to remember. Okay? And I didn't spell bisphosphate right, so we'll go back and fix that, because again, lunchtime is coming. But oh well. So let's fix bisphosphate, pressing all these buttons, bisphosphate. Okay. Now here's the funny thing that happens. The funny thing that happens is that this breaks into 2 molecules. Right? One of them is the dihydroxyacetone phosphate. And the other one is the glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. But because of the action of the enzyme, the isomerase enzyme, the dihydroxyacetone phosphate can also quickly turn into a glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, which means that effectively we have 2 glyceraldehyde 3-phosphates. Right? So what that means is then the result of this, coming out of this step, means essentially what we have now are 2 glyceraldehyde 3-phosphates. So I'll write it like this. glyceraldehyde 3 phosphates. So that's not another step. That green arrow is just trying to show that that's the effect. You know what? I got a better idea. Instead of the arrow, we'll draw it as a sort of a and see how we now have 2. So everything from this point on is going to be double. And there's no S on phosphate. Okay, so then the glyceraldehyde 3 phosphate, okay, 2 glyceraldehyde 3 phosphate is going to turn into the 1,3 bisphosphoglycerate. And there will be 2 of them. So 2, 1,3 bisphosphoglycerate. And there's something that happens at this stage. In order to make this happen, I'll just do it over here a little bit, we had to have 2 NAD molecules, because everything's happening twice, come into this, and then what comes out are 2 NADH molecules. And also, what goes in are 2 inorganic phosphates to be added on. Okay, good to go. I'll leave that there while we do the next step. The next step then would be 2 3 phosphoglycerates. Phosphoglycerate. Excellent. Then the 3 phosphoglycerate gets turned into 2 phosphoglycerates. Whoops. Two phosphoglycerate. Then, very quickly, we're almost there. The phosphoglycerate here gets turned into 2 phosphenolpyruvates. Pyruvate. And of course, to make this happen, we have to extract 2 waters out. 2 H2Os. Then we have the last step, which would be producing 2 pyruvates. Two pyruvate molecules, and in order, at this step, the change here, we have to go like this and do 2 ADP, zip in, zip out, 2 ATP are utilized to remove that. Okay, and so that's a summary. So tomorrow what we'll do is we'll investigate what all this means in terms of the energy that's happening. We'll do another sort of summary and look at that.